I hope that your bellies are full of candy, or you're trying to keep it away from your children as best you can. So we'll start by, let me get my thing here. We'll start by with Alex. Thanks, or welcome to the second committee on rulemaking, regulatory enforcement manuals. We'll start with Alexandra Saibo, who will call the two rolls. The first roll will be the names of committee members and alternates of committee members, and after each name is called, the person should say here. So we can make sure their mics are working. And the second roll call will be the names of ACUS members who are not on the committee and alternates. So I'll pass it over to Alexandra.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Bertrand. For those of you who weren't here last time, my name's Alexandra Saibo, as Bertrand said. I've been very pleased to be staff counsel at ACUS for this project. And we will go ahead and get started with our first roll call from members of the Committee on Rulemaking. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And as Bertrand said, please unmute when you hear your name and then remute yourself. Much appreciated. And of course, we'll start with Bertrand, our wonderful committee chair.
I am here.
Thank you so much. And Emily Bremer will be joining us in a little bit. Next up, Peter Constantine.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm here.
Good afternoon. Thanks Peter. Kirti Datla.
Hi, I'm here.
Thank you. Thank you. Andrew Emery.
Here.
Thank you. Michael Hertz.
I'm here.
Thank you very much. Tom Johnson.
I'm here.
Thank you. Elena Ness.
Good afternoon, I'm here.
Thank you, Elena. Richard Pierce. Okay. Mitchell Plave.
I am here.
Thank you very much. David Pritzker.
I'm here.
Thank you, David. Lon Smith.
I'm here.
Thank you. And Kevin is having some technical difficulties, I see. Kevin Stack.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Okay, thank you.
And next up, Miriam Vincent.
I'm here.
Thank you, Miriam. All right. Are there any members of the Committee on Rulemaking who are here at this time who did not hear their name called? Great. Thank you all. We will move on to our second roll call. ACUS members not on this particular committee and alternates who are present today. Thank you all for joining us. Much appreciated. And we start here with our wonderful ACUS Williams Fellow, our project consultant, Jordan Perkins.
Here.
Thank you, Jordan. Next up, James Giaraputo, alternate for OSHA.
Hello, everyone. Here.
Thank you very much. Next up, Bill Funk.
Here, present.
Thank you, Bill. Much appreciated. Next up, Noel Green. Okay, and next up, Joe Salome. Are there any other ACUS members or alternates who are present at this time who did not hear their name called? All right, I will happily turn it back over to you, Bertrand. Oh, I'm so sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you. Get this right somehow. So I'll start by explaining the standard meeting protocols. So please note that only ACUS members, including government members, public members, senior fellows, liaison representatives, and special counsels, whether or not on the committee, and their designated alternates have full speaking privileges. To avoid background noise, though, I'd ask that you keep your microphone on mute and either use Zoom's hand raise features or add a comment on the chat feature if you'd like to speak. I'll then call on you and you can unmute yourself. Please then remute yourself when you're done. I'd also ask that ACUS members and their designated alternates use the webcam to facilitate the conversation. With respect to attendees other than ACUS members and alternates, participation requires a unanimous consent of the committee members. Time permitting, I'll consider calling on such attendees at appropriate points and will presume that committee members consent absent their raising an objection. If any such participant would like to speak, please so indicate in the chat feature or by using Zoom's hand raise features and wait to speak until I call on you. You can then unmute yourself and please remute yourself when you are done speaking. For all participants, please use the chat feature only to indicate that you'd like to speak, or for committee members and their alternates to vote when asked. Please do not hold any sidebar discussions or put substantive comments in the chat feature. Only members of the rulemaking committee, including government members and their designated alternates, public members, senior fellows, liaison representatives, and special counsels have a vote. Please do not vote unless you're a member of the committee. We have a list of committee members in case you're unsure. So with that standard protocol having been read, why don't we kind of jump on into the discussion? I'll have Alexandra share the screen. And as we did in the prior meeting, we will start by going through the recommendations. We've had some comments and revisions to the recommendations based on our last meeting. We've also have had some comments and some suggested revisions to the preamble, but we'll start with recommendation, and I will do as I did last time, go one by one through the recommendations. Please let me know if you need me to slow down as we work through them, and feel free to go back to previous recommendations if a thought or idea comes to mind that we should consider. Okay. So after working through the recommendations and seeking out feedback, I will turn to our project consultant, Jordan Perkins, to get his views on various matters and thoughts that are presented, and as part of our revision process. Okay. So the first recommendation has to do with developing enforcement manuals. Recommendation number 1. I don't believe there have been any edits to the actual recommendation itself, but let's go through it again to see if there are any thoughts or feedback on recommendation number 1. I'll give you a moment to read through it and then ask if there are any comments, feedback, or suggested changes. Okay, assuming folks have had time to read it, are there any comments or feedback on recommendation number 1? Yes, Miriam.
This is just a technical recommendation, just for clarity. Between laws and they, add the word that.
On line 54?
On line 54, it's for plain language. And so it makes it more
Right.
clear for anyone who's not who does not have English as their first language.
Right. Are there any objections to that technical change that Miriam's offered? Technical revision that Miriam's offered? Okay. We'll incorporate that in. Thank you, Miriam.
Could you please clarify where you are? Where is this?
Line 54 on recommendation number 1. It's now in pink on my screen, adding that between laws and they.
I'm asking because the copy that I'm looking at dated draft October. Oh, I haven't seen November 1st. Is that a new one today?
Alexander.
This is the same draft. It just incorporates the edits from the committee today that we're doing right now. And it incorporates the comments from Michael Hertz, Bernie Bell, and Matt Weiner.
What I'm asking is whether all of us have received a copy of what's on the screen now. The
Yes,
one
you
I'm
have.
looking at is October 28th.
Yes, I changed the date to make it clear that we're editing it today.
But have we received what we're seeing on the screen?
Yes.
Alexander, was the email, what date was the email? So it might be easier for David to search for it.
It was on Friday, the 28th.
Thank you. All right, so any other suggestions with respect to recommendation number 1? Okay, so let's move forward to recommendation number 2, and we'll take these by letter, starting with 2A. Any thoughts? Is that a lingering hand, Miriam, or is that a new hand? No, thank you. Any suggestions on 2A? Okay, let's move on to 2B. Any thoughts or feedback on 2B? Okay. And any thoughts or feedback on 2C? Yes, Bill.
Yeah, I have a problem with this statement. The manual does not necessarily reflect the views of other agency officials. Can anybody give me an example where there'd be an agency enforcement manual where other agency officials wouldn't agree with it? I mean, I understand the last phrase does not bind the agency as a whole, but I just don't understand this. You know, we have members of the agency, officials, not employees, but officials who don't agree with this thing. I don't understand that.
So, Jordan, I know you weren't necessarily part of drafting the recommendations in terms of the language, but in terms of your research and your report, is that language appropriate or necessary to be included in 2C?
So my research doesn't really touch on this. This is sort of an internal separation of powers issue, I would think. But my research didn't really, I don't have a comment on this based on.
Okay. Any other thoughts? David, please.
I think that the background of the changes in this subsection, subparagraph, in part were in response to comments I made at our last meeting concerning the extent to which the manual's content may be relied upon. And I'm thinking of the general public, and you may recall that I based my comment on experience I had when I was on detail in a regulatory agency's ombudsman's office, where we had received complaints from the public that there was what appeared to be guidance on the agency's website that when people relied on it, turned out not to be reliable. So that was the point I made then, and suggested there be some language to deal with that situation. And the draft now does not address that directly, but I suspect that's part of why the language that you see was placed in there.
So maybe there could be clarifying language. Maybe the language of the manual does not necessarily reflect the views of other agency officials is not the best language. Would the language does not bind the agency as a whole? Is that responsive to your comment, David, from the earlier meeting? Or do you think that there needs to be other language better reflecting your thoughts?
Well, I see it that's a partial, that's a possible solution, whether it is clear enough to a non-government person, someone who needs to be, who is being regulated by the regulations under consideration, just needs to be informed that it's intended to be useful, but you can't necessarily rely on it. And I don't have specific language other than what I suggested last time, which is the extent to which persons may rely upon the provisions of the enforcement manual, something like that.
Okay.
That's the problem I'm trying to solve.
Right.
And the fact that there are other parts of the agency that may have different views doesn't tell me, the regulated person, whether I should pay any attention to it.
Okay. Okay, so we could potentially I'll hear others, and then we'll see if we can come up with language that's responsive to your comments, David, and see how other people think about it. Peter.
Well, let me
sorry,
say
David.
one more thing,
Sure.
please. You may consider this out of order because it concerns the preamble, but it's on this very point. And it's the language that's been added in the second paragraph of the preamble that currently is proposed to read, although enforcement manuals should not bind agencies as a whole. And I would suggest that if you're going to keep that language, that you put in the word or words necessarily bind or automatically bind, or maybe both, should not necessarily or automatically bind agencies as a whole.
Okay.
If it read like that, I think that would go more toward addressing my problem with the reliance.
Okay. And so that suggested change is for recommendation to C, or is that recommended change of language in the preamble?
Well, those words necessarily or automatically should not necessarily automatically bind agencies. I'm suggesting be inserted in the preamble,
Okay.
but using a phrase like that may help solve the problem in 2C.
Okay. Okay, so it could be does not, if we wanted to add that language into 2C, it could be does not automatically necessarily or automatically bind. So but between does and not adding necessarily or automatically.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. And then the or after necessarily. Yeah. Thank you, Alexandra. Okay, so we'll work with that as a starting point. Alec or Peter, I'm sorry.
Thanks. And first, thanks, Bill, for raising this. When we last met, I struggled with, as an agency official, the meaning of this and just the explanation of the problem being resolved. I think this edit helps. My assumption is after it says does not necessarily automatically bind the agency, we would get rid of reflect the views of other agency officials. I just have a hard time thinking that an agency, let's say OSHA for DOL or the Mine Safety and Health Administration, would put out an enforcement manual and you would have people within that agency saying, well, no, we don't necessarily follow it. You know, it could be there's an issue where it's outdated guidance or things like that, but I would have a hard time thinking that you would have something out there where agency officials would hopefully say, well, I don't necessarily agree with that. Maybe there would be rogue or uninformed officials. So I think it's hard to see of a situation where a manual is put out. You would have people saying, oh, no, it doesn't reflect the views of the agency that put it out. So I think this edit makes me feel a little better. And again, the comment, the explanation is why this was first raised. You know, I just recall the last administration where we went through so much energy on posting guidance that was no longer in effect, but indicating it was no longer in effect. I don't know if that goes to the concern that there may have been enforcement manuals. People say, well, that's out of date, or we don't follow that. So this edit I'm seeing on C takes away my, anxiety about the language.
Okay, so the addition of David's proposed language and then deleting reflecting the views of other agency officials are the two proposed changes on paper right now. Jeremy.
Yeah, so for clarification, the language preceding does not bind the agency as a whole was in the last draft that the committee considered. It was previously an A. It was only moved to be a C for clarification. So David, it was not added in response to your language. This was intended to account for situations in which enforcement bureaus within agencies develop enforcement manuals, and they do not carry the imprimatur of agency heads. So I don't know if Jordan has additional thoughts on that, but that is the situation this was meant to cover.
Well, I like the previous suggestion to include my words necessarily or automatically and delete the phrase about not reflecting the views of other officials. I think that goes a long way to solving the problem. And as for the comment about things being out of date and unreliable in that sense in the prior administration or at any time, I think there are other sections in the current draft that address that.
Got it. Okay.
As for the word necessarily or automatically, I would say the words does not bind the agency as a whole. That was added in response to Nina Mendelssohn's comment the previous meeting that we should pull in language from recommendation 2017-5, which states, although a policy statement should not bind an agency whole without qualification. So that is, for consistency's sake, I raised that for the committee's consideration.
Okay. So there's kind of 2 points I hear you raising, Jeremy. The first one with respect to the language reflect the views of other agency officials is responsive to the context in which the political appointee may not share the views of the regulatory enforcement manual that is perhaps made by a prior administration or by the civil servants in the agency.
Less that situation, more just that the agency head might not be involved in the process at all.
Okay.
At a basic point, a lot of these manuals, I mean, Jordan, jump in if I'm getting this wrong, are produced by enforcement bureaus, not necessarily with the involvement of the agency head.
Okay. Okay. So that's important to take into account as to whether we want to delete that language as is the proposed revision right now. Thanks, Jeremy, for that. Let me turn it over to Bill.
Well, I really strongly think you have to take this language out the way it's been taken out here. I mean, Jeremy, what would you think about something that says does not necessarily reflect the views of the head of the agency? All right. I mean, that would just be, here's your enforcement manual, but it may not reflect the views of the head of the agency. I mean, no, it's, if the head of the agency wants to change it, get to change it. If he doesn't care about it, then it's the agency adopting it. I mean, I just, under a delegation, I just think saying, hey, we got lots of people running around out here. This doesn't necessarily reflect the views of the agency. I mean, I think unless you go to a lot more explanation, that has to come out. My other point, though, was to be more responsive to David Pritzker, because as Jeremy pointed out, this bind the agency as a whole goes to the question of if it binds the agency as a whole, then maybe it has to be a notice and comment legislative rule. And we don't want that. So we want to be able to make clear that it doesn't bind the agency as a whole, even if it binds individual employees within the agency. To be responsive to David Pritzker, I think you could add at the end, after the whole, and that members of the public should not necessarily rely upon what is contained in the manual. That makes it very explicit that this is for internal agency purposes and people outside shouldn't rely on it.
Okay. Is that language that Alexandra has put forth reflect your proposed revision, Bill?
The language that's just been added?
Yeah, just been added, the last line of C.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, so we have that change put forth. I also want to return to Jeremy's point that insofar as we are adding necessarily or automatically, we're deviating from the language in a prior ACUS manual 2017-5 that Nina pointed out as something we should look to for consistency purposes. So I don't know if that changes our views as to whether we want to include it or not, but I just wanted to kind of repeat that point that Jeremy made. Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Patrol. Two thoughts. One's just a little small wordsmithy thing, which is, should we strike, I don't know if we need general public in what was language just added, that is, and that the public should, I don't know what's going on with should not generally rely on, I'll have to think about that one. But let me go, I think I'm opposed to the idea of deviating from the prior recommendation on this question of necessarily or automatically. I think this kind of puts the agency in the position of the default almost seems to be that it would bind the agency as a whole. Maybe that's what we think, I don't know, but now it's just, it doesn't necessarily, it almost seems like the implication is that it would unless the agency said it didn't. And maybe that's the right presumption, I don't know. But I haven't gone back and read the other recommendation, but I wonder, and the manual does not, should not bind the agency as a whole. I think that covers the point that Bill Funk was making, that then it doesn't create a problem of having to go through notice and comment on it. But this sort of creates an issue, which is now does the agency have to say in its guidance or in its manual every time? I mean, maybe they should, I don't know. I'm just raising that question there. And I guess on the second, now back to the second generally, and the agency as a whole, and that the public should not, I don't know what we mean by should not generally rely upon the manual, or I'm not sure about that second generally. Maybe another person can intervene on that.
Yeah.
I'd like to replace that generally with necessarily again. That's closer to what I had in mind.
Okay. So changing generally to necessarily.
And if in any sense this whole subparagraph modifies, at least in the context of enforcement manuals, anything that the conference said 5 years ago, that's okay.
Okay. Kevin, is that change from generally to necessarily responsive to your concerns about that language in that last line? You're mute right now.
That's sorry. I think so.
Okay. Okay, so we have some shifts in the language. I don't know in terms of how to kind of get a sense of where people stand. Does anybody object to the changes that have been proposed to 2C? I'll give folks a chance to read it and read through the crossouts. And just to kind of clarify, I believe that should not bind language now is entirely consistent with 2017-5. Is that right, Jeremy? Yeah, okay. Not that that should be dictate what we do now, but just a point of information.
I can't see clearly on my screen whether automatically has been crossed out too.
It has been. So right now it reads, describing the manual's purpose, scope, organization, and legal effect, including a disclaimer, if applicable, that the manual should not bind the agency as a whole, and that the public should not necessarily rely upon the manual.
Well, the last part of it is entirely responsive to my initial concern, but I'd like to hear more comment on whether where I had suggested putting in necessarily or automatically bind,
Okay.
Whether people would like to see that in. I would like to see some kind of modifier there.
Okay.
I don't know whether others agree.
Okay, so the Davis proposal is that it should say the manual should not necessarily or automatically bind, or one of those qualifiers should be included, or both. And another proposal was to take that out. So I wanted to get thoughts on from others. Bill.
With all due respect to David, I just don't think you need it. I think should not bind is as good as should not necessarily automatically bind. The agency will decide whether it wants it to bind or not, and they'll say so. I just think the disclaimer, if applicable, with the manual should not bind. I think that does it.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. Lon?
I think I agree with that. As I read the language, if there were a disclaimer made right just like this by an agency, and I'm a regulated party, I can't tell whether I can rely on it or not.
Other thoughts? Thanks, Lon. David, is that responsive, or should we could take a vote on that language to see where people stand in terms of whether to adopt a revision? Jordan, I guess you had a thought.
So this is related, I think. I think as a general rule for the 20 or so manuals I looked at, they almost never bind the agency. And part of that is from FOIA, that they need to be promulgated through notice and comment or something like that if they are binding. Generally, these reflect the views of the, as Jeremy said, either the General Counsel's Office or the Centralized Division of Enforcement for the purpose of controlling the discretion of line enforcement staff. Usually, the agencies that make these publicly available make them available as sort of a service to the public where they can see the agency's internal decision-making process, but it's not really meant to be a clear statement to the public of what the agency thinks the public needs to know about the rule. So I'm not sure that the language necessarily is, for most enforcement manuals, sort of necessary, because usually they're not meant to be sort of, the public is not the primary audience. And, you know, telling the public what their rights and obligations are is not the primary purpose, if that makes sense.
Okay.
If I may interrupt again, maybe, and I hope for the last time on this section, I am completely persuaded by what's just been said, because on rereading the beginning of this, describing the purpose, scope, organization, and legal effect of what follows. Yeah, I think that if the agency does that, then we don't need my modifiers.
Okay. Thanks, David. Any other comments with respect to the revised 2C? All right, without further ado, let's move forward to 2D.
Actually, Michael Hertz wanted to go back to B.
Oh, 2B. Okay, yes, Michael. Sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was
Sorry.
not quick enough when you first raised it.
Sorry.
It's not a fundamental point, but as I read this, the lack of clarity is that when it refers to agency employees, does it actually mean the names of individual human beings, David Jones and Allison Smith, or does it mean the staff positions? And I think it should mean the latter, that to have an actual list of individuals who happen to be working at the agency at this moment, which will turn over and raise potential privacy issues and so on, would be inappropriate. But it's a natural reading of this language. And I think if we could come up with some language that made clear we're talking about the sort of staff positions that are covered by the manual rather than the individuals. I don't know if that's an idiosyncratic concern, but
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So anybody have suggested language that would make it clear that we're not intending to identify the particular employee, but rather the agency staff?
Does that really solve the problem though? Because I mean, when I originally read this thing, I had the same thought that Michael did. And I thought, but no, of course you're not going to identify him by name. You can't possibly read it that way. And so I said, well, you can just leave it the way it is, because you couldn't possibly intend to mean identify the individuals. And I tried fiddling with the language too. And you know, it was hard to come up with something that wasn't itself somewhat unknown.
Well, let's just sit with this for a moment and see, as just kind of reflect and think as to what possibilities there might be, if any.
I mean,
What about?
It's very hard to come up with language that works with directed act and conformity, but one might say something like identifying the agency staff positions that are covered by the manual, or something like that.
Okay.
That are subject to the manual's directions.
That would be okay. I mean, none of this is incredibly elegant, but
Yeah.
and maybe everyone agrees with Bill. I mean, I you know, that I'm creating a problem that doesn't exist, but the fact that we both tripped over it.
All right. No, there is ambiguity. I see it now. Identifying agency staff positions that are subject to the manual and directed to. Yeah, the directed to act in conformity is kind of tripping me up with respect to the staff positions. I don't know in terms of what revision could be made to
Maybe the agency staff positions to which the manual is directed.
to which the manual is directed. Okay. Yes, Andrew, sorry. I didn't see your hand.
I kind of agree with Bill's, I think, original comment that leaving it as employees, people will figure it out. And I think with this and even our discussions early on C, to the lead into this whole paragraph, I think it's a lead in from whatever it is to, you know, it says this is, I think it's something like, isn't like whether, but how does it say it? Development Force should consider. These are the things to consider. I think we don't need to nail it down so tightly. Having it say, you know, the agent employees, I think is fine. I think saying positions is a little bit strange because it might apply to an office, but that office might have 10 different positions in it. So I think positions almost makes it more potentially confusing. But I honestly think with the lead in, we just don't need to
Yeah,
get into this level of detail.
Right. So Andrew's proposal is to kind of leave as is, that the lead in offers or prevents any sort of ambiguity or precludes it from raising problems.
Well, a tiny change would be to go back to the original, but change the who, which is really about individuals, to that.
Okay.
Employees that. That
Okay.
at least is a step towards the position rather than the individual.
So identify agency officials that, I guess, and going back to the original C, how it was written.
Yeah, just that are directed to
act in conformity with the manual. Okay.
Would we want to say and offices or offices?
Identify agency employees and or offices that are directed to act in conformity with the manual.
That makes it even more confusing, I think, because then it makes it sound like the employees are real people.
Right.
Right. It makes it clear you don't have to identify the individuals, but it does make them sound like individuals.
Right. I mean, this is not, ideal, but maybe it's what we have. Lon, did you have a hand up for respond that you want to raise something here?
All right, one last shot at it.
Yep.
How about identifying which offices within the agency are subject to or directed by by the manual, something like that. So you're focusing on offices and get employees and individuals out of it.
So identifying which offices within the agency, are directed to act in conformity with the manual.
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's an improvement.
Okay. Other thoughts in terms of, I mean, both are somewhat ambiguous, but perhaps this is less ambiguous than the other. And I think it's clear with this revision that we're not suggesting that the agency should consider identifying persons. Any objections to the proposed change? Okay. All right, we'll incorporate that without any objection. Okay. All right, so I'm going to jump to 2D now. And I guess going back to 2A, is there that similar concern that we are suggesting that the agency consider identifying the person by name, or is it appropriate to identify the person by name in 2D?
I think there it's actually appropriate for it to be the person. Again, all of this is optional because of the heading and optional because of the or office here.
Right.
But when you're being told to get in touch with the agency, often agencies say, here's the person to get in touch with. And that's a useful thing for agencies to do and not mandatory under this proposal.
Okay. Any other thoughts on 2D? So let's move forward to 2E. Any thoughts or comments on 2E? Okay, we'll move forward to 2F. Any thoughts on comments or on 2F? Okay, we'll move forward to 2G. Any thoughts or comments on 2G? Okay, we'll move forward to 2H. Any thoughts or comments on 2H? Okay, we'll move forward to 2I. Any thoughts or comments on 2I? Okay, move forward to 2J. Any thoughts or comments on 2J? Okay, we'll move forward to 2K. Any thoughts or comments on 2K? Okay, moving forward to 2L. Any thoughts or comments on 2L? Okay, we'll scroll on to the next page then. And this is 2Ms in addition based on our last meeting. I think it was, I forget who raised the point. But any thoughts on comments on 2M? Yes, Bill.
I don't understand why it's here. Whistleblower protections are certainly a lot broader than enforcement actions. In fact, I'm not even sure that they come up most often with respect to enforcement actions. It doesn't, nothing in M ties it to enforcement actions. All the other recommendations are tied to enforcement actions. I just don't understand why it's here at all.
Okay. So I'm going to turn to Jordan
That's
first.
just deletion.
Yeah, I'll turn to Jordan first before I turn to Peter in terms of his thoughts in response to Bill's comments. I know this was an addition suggested, but based on your own research, what do you think in terms of where whistleblower protections would fit in?
Right. As you said, this was an addition based on some trying to remove language from one of the other letters. I can't remember exactly what was going on there. But there are situations in which agency enforcement manuals describe whistleblower provisions as part of, for example, the complaint process. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's enforcement manuals, for example, if you have some kind of complaint against a nuclear facility at which you work, then it's in the enforcement manual how you would bring that, or sort of how the enforcement staff would input those and sort of incorporate them into an ongoing investigation or use them as the basis of, opening an investigation. So it's something that does come up in enforcement manuals, but whether this is, part of the recommendation or not is obviously not my expertise.
Okay. So that's some of the background where they might fit in. So I'll go to Peter and then come back to Bill.
Yeah, thanks. Since I was the one who suggested it. And I recall when our last meeting, there was conversations about this general area. And I think my recommendation came from that. And I think Jordan's right. I don't think this is something that's critical we have in there, but I think sometimes enforcement actions do touch on whistleblower protections and knowing there are other avenues available to folks. So in the sense of good government, I think it's always a good idea to include this language in there. I came from working at Office of Special Counsel, so I'll admit I'm biased. But if people feel strongly it doesn't fit, I'm fine with that. I just think it's helpful to have that language in there.
Okay.
But again, not worth dying over my sword over.
Right. So Bill, how strongly do you feel? Can I come back to you?
Well, I wanted to respond, I wanted to follow up with Jordan, because as he described it, it was people working in the nuclear plant who would be making some statement to NRC agency personnel. Does whistleblower law apply to that? I mean, I don't think it does. I mean, whistleblower protections are for agency employees, not for private employees who would, rat on their employers. So now I'm really confused because this seems to talk about whistleblower protections for agency personnel rather than for people outside the agency who would be making complaints to the agency personnel. So I'm even stronger against it than I was before. And I understand Peter's point coming from special counsel, but I just don't see how whistleblower protections for agency personnel applies in enforcement. I understand Jordan's point that it's important to know if there are some sort of whistleblower protections for people in the private sector who might make complaints.
Okay. Since you raised Jordan's name first, I'll go to him and then turn back to Peter.
Yeah, I think Bill is right in that this wouldn't be part of sort of the general whistleblower protections. I may be getting over my skis here, but my recollection is this would be something that would be part of the enabling act or the statutes. The agency itself is responsible for governing a specific whistleblower provision, for employees in nuclear plants as opposed to the general whistleblower protections.
Peter.
Yeah, hearing the conversation, since I was the one who recommended it, I'm fine taking it up because I struggle with it. And I've also seen situations where even within an agency, an investigator may make the recommendation, there's an enforcement action that should be done and it doesn't go forward. And they're like, well, where do I take these? Hearing this conversation, I think the language raises more confusion than any benefit it has. So I'm fine taking it out.
Okay. So right now, the proposal is to delete 2M. Are there any objections to that deletion? Okay, not hearing any objections, then we will turn to the new 2M that used to be 2N to see if there are any comments or thoughts onto the new 2M. Okay, then moving forward to 2N. Are there any thoughts or comments on 2N? Okay, not hearing any thoughts. We'll move over to down to recommendation 3. Any thoughts or comments on recommendation 3? Yes, Michael.
I think I would just delete such as by providing a table of contents and an index. It, in a way, it's sort of undermining. In other words, the recommendation seemed a lot more ambitious until it turned out that the kind of thing we're talking about is a table of contents and an index, which almost goes without saying and is, you know, and so it's actually sort of more forceful and in a way slightly clearer without that.
Okay. So the proposal is to take out the language after the comma after comprehensive fashion, removing such as by providing a table of contents and index in an index. I'll turn it over first to Jordan and see if he has any thoughts on that in terms of how ambitious he I know the staff kind of work with the recommendations, but how ambitious he thinks recommendation 3 should be.
So that was included, I think, in response to something that was in my report, which is, you know, the cost benefit analysis involved in an agency deciding to make an enforcement manual public depends in part on the fact that it is a very easy to use document. It has a table of contents, it has an index, it's very easy to find what you need in the enforcement manual as compared to going to the agency's website and going through a list of, you know, 1,000 guidance documents that have been promulgated over the past 10 years and trying to find the one that's responsive to what you need. So I think what I tried to flag is this is one of the key features of an enforcement manual that makes it more useful than other forms of guidance documents if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. But,
okay,
you know,
so sorry to interrupt, but that's great. I mean, that makes perfect sense. Then here, let me offer a friendly amendment to my own suggestion, which is get rid of such as by providing and replace it with and include.
Okay, so take out such as by providing and add and include a table of contents and an index. Okay. And so that would combine the ease of use concerns that Jordan raises with the desire to encourage agencies to develop a comprehensive manual that Michael's raising. Any objections to the change?
Hello, everyone. Hope everyone is well.
Hi, Andy. How are you doing?
Okay, Bertrand.
Good, good. All right, so we will move now to recommendation number 4. Are any thoughts or comments on recommendation number 4? Okay, so we'll move forward to recommendation number 5, and we'll just address it comprehensively rather than going through A, B, and C. So the entire recommendation 5, I'll give you some time to read through it. Any thoughts or comments on recommendation number 5? Okay, we'll move forward to the next section on disseminating enforcement manuals, recommendation number 6. Yes, Bill.
Well, my memory is I raised this issue last time it was overruled, but I'll try again. And that is that it's at least or make enforcement manuals available, searchable electronic format. I still think that there may be agencies where, you know, it's easier, cheaper not to have a searchable electronic format in an internal network and have something that's more old fashioned. I mean, I have no idea, no problems in suggesting that searchable electronic format is preferable, right? But to say it's sort of absolutely necessary just seems to me maybe to go too far. And I, you know, I was Jordan who sort of convinced, if not me, others last time. And so I like to hear from him again if my idea of just making it sort of a preference as opposed to a requirement would satisfy him.
Yes, Jordan.
So I don't have any dispositive thoughts on the matter. I think the advantage of it being electronically available is that can be kept up to date more readily than, you know, reprinting a 200-page book for every member of the enforcement staff on a periodic basis. So I do think it's preferable. But, you know, I don't have any expertise on exactly the issue of the bill.
Yeah. So there could be changes in the language. What is there changes that you have in mind, Bill, that would shift it from a presumption that they will make it available in this way versus a preference?
Not off the top of my head. Let me think about it a little bit.
Okay.
Maybe go on and go back.
Sounds good. Elena.
Yeah, I think just going with what was just said, I just wanted to add that in my experience, version control is easier to manage electronically, and it can be very difficult to get those old manuals out of the hands of people when they've been updated. And so, you know, I think it might be wise to encourage electronic dissemination for that reason.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that.
So thank you, Elena. So, I mean, is there a way to maybe?
You know, I'd be happy if you just took out at least. Agency should.
Okay. Got it. So I'll let the committee sit with that language for us a few seconds to see if there are any objections to that change or other suggested modifications. I guess I'll turn to you, Jordan. Is there a concern that removing the language at least would shift priorities in a way that would go against your findings in the report?
I don't think so. If I remember correctly, the at least language was not initially in the recommendation, but I could be wrong on.
Okay. Okay. If there are no objections right now, we will move forward. Of course, feel free to come back if you have objections with respect to any of the recommendations we've covered so far. But right now, we'll move forward to recommendation number 7.
Come here, girl.
Oh, yes, Mike Mitchell, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Question about 7, it doesn't seem to have any kind of reservation for material that might be privileged. You know, usually in these kinds of descriptions, we would say something like as appropriate or consistent with privilege, consistent with withholding documents for privilege purposes. It just sounds like agencies should always make enforcement manuals available publicly. Because it seems it would always improve public awareness. And I mean, that's actually not even the point. It's just that it's not qualified at all.
Okay. So Mitchell raised the point, the lack of qualification for accounting for privileged parts of the enforcement manual. I'll start with Jordan to see his thoughts on whether there should be some qualifier added to recommendation 7, or his thoughts on that.
I mean, the point is obviously valid that agency officials should not make things that are privileged available on the website. I'm not sure. I would defer to other ACUS staff on the way that we usually do things and recommendations.
We'll start with Bill and then turn to, or Jeremy, you want to chime in right now?
Only to point out the phrase "or portions thereof," which was meant to leave open the option that there are things that would not be disclosed, especially when read in combination with recommendation 10.
Okay.
I take your point. Thank you.
Okay, got it. I see.
My concern was the and if adequate resources available, which sounded like that was the only other consideration. And you know, I take that 10 sort of takes care of most of the problem that I and others may have felt about what else should not be included. But the fact that the 10 is way down there, you know, why not make 10 sort of a sub or part of 7? So make it clear that, you know, I mean, because 8 and 9 could follow what's 10 now. 10 doesn't have to be after them.
Right.
So
Right.
I think you would get across this idea better if you could just sort of either move 10 up and make it the new 8 or put it as part of 7.
Okay. So the proposal is to move 10 up to either make it 8 or part of 7. Is there any preference between those two options, Bill?
No, I'm happy either way.
Okay. So the proposed is to move 10 up. Then in a way, you know, follows naturally from 7, perhaps clarifies what agency should do under 7. David.
Before this conversation, I was troubled by 7 and 8 seeming to address different aspects of the same thing, but in different ways. So now with the conversation about 10, my suggestion is to incorporate 7, 8, and 10 into a new 7 that has subparts and covers these various points.
Okay. So it would be 7 would become 8 would become A, 9 current 9 would become B, or vice versa. I don't know if you have a preference with respect to the order of current 8 or 9 in your proposal.
No, I don't have any preference about that. I'm just suggesting that 7, 8, and I guess 9 as well, and 10
Right.
all are on the same general subject.
Okay.
And it could be simplified by putting them as subparts of a new 7.
Okay. So why don't we sort of make a modification here, Alexandra, to make 8A 7A and make 9 7B and see how that sits with people. So any thoughts? Yes, Michael.
I mean, obviously the stakes are low here. To me, it makes more sense to have 3 separate paragraphs. I don't understand why A and B are sub of 7. You could make the full paragraph of 7, 7A, and then the next one 7B, and the next one 7C, but then I don't know what we've gained over just having separate paragraphs.
Okay. and the advantage of separate paragraphs, Michael, you think in terms of clarity?
Well, it's a little unclear to have A and B as sort of subsections of what's now 7. I think what's now 7 and what's now 7A and what's now 7B are 3, standalone propositions.
Right.
One is not a subset. The current A and B are not really subsets of 7.
Right.
So.
Well, I agree that they're not subsets, but what I had in mind when I suggested putting these together is that to some extent, what used to be 10 was brought up in the conversation as modifying or limiting 7. So to the extent that there is some modification or commentary on 7, that was what I was thinking of when I suggested putting them together in some form.
Right, I totally see that, but then maybe the thing to do is rather than making old 10 8, in other words, going back to the question that Bertrell asked of Bill, should this be part of 7 or should old 10 be part of 7 or should it be 8? Maybe it really should be part of 7 for that reason.
Okay.
And because those really are connected. What's going to go up, right? What are the portion? Well,
Right.
When does something go up and what is it?
Right.
And then current B would then be 8 because that's a sort of separate idea. Current 8 would then be 9.
Right. Okay, so
I like that.
The alternative is to make A part of 7 and then B, then recommendation 8. And then old 7 would still be 7. It would just be, yeah. There you go. And that's kind of hard to work with, huh? Track changes, moving things up. But old 7 would still stay 7. And it would just be what is now 7 there would just be after remain up to date, just adding that sentence to the end of 7. Yeah, there you go. Thank you, Alexandra. So that's how it looks right now. Let me give you guys a chance to read it. Read both 7 and 8 together since we are the changes are connected in a way. So just focusing on 7, are there any thoughts and comments on 7 as it's currently constructed? And any objections to the change proposed? Okay, without objections, we'll incorporate that shift and then we'll move on to 8. Any objections to 8 or any thoughts on 8? Yes, Kirti.
I wonder if, because there are caveats in 7 about when agencies need to post versions on websites that aren't in 8, to avoid making 8 seem like agencies should always be posting versions on the website, you could say something like when an agency posts a publicly available version, or when an agency posts publicly available versions of enforcement manuals.
Okay.
And then also in that section, I think I understand this to mean that the agency should be describing like what the manual is in a clear and logical fashion, but because there is, I think in section 3 earlier, a recommendation that the manuals themselves be clear and logically presented. I wondered if maybe the word present could be, if I'm understanding what this is supposed to mean, then the word present could be swapped with describe, maybe.
So, okay, so we have a couple changes. So we're starting with the agencies post publicly available versions of the enforcement manuals. They should post it in an easily identified location on their website and describe them in a clear and logical fashion. Okay, does that capture the changes?
Yeah, and then I think maybe it should be post them instead of post it.
Them. Okay, right. Right. Okay. So I'll let that sit with us for a second. Yes, Peter.
Thanks. I like this edit. I think originally my focus was less on describing it, but also presenting them for folks who may not have access or normally use the web, things like that, that they're easily find, that can be found, observed, searched in an easy manner. But I'm fine with the descriptions, but I just want to get some context. I was thinking more in terms of actually, yeah, where is it on the web page? How is it made available? How is it presented? But I'm good with describe as well. So I'm not recommending a change, just kind of putting where sharing my perspective for
Okay.
what it's worth.
Okay. And so with that explanation in mind, Kirti, do you still think that describe is the best word to use there?
Well, I just want to make sure I understand, was the suggestion also, as long as the suggestion was not also suggesting like they should be available in paper form and, you know, a document library or something like that, then I think it's capturing both what I was wondering about and the intent.
Okay. Peter?
Thank God, no, that's not what I was thinking. So no, I think it's fine. So yeah, I'm in complete agreement. Yep.
Okay. Bill?
Well, I want to argue strongly in favor of present rather than describe.
Okay.
Because I thought that was the idea, that you're posting them in an easily identifiable location, and they should be presented. That is, the publicly available versions of the enforcement manuals should present them in a clear and logical fashion so people can access them well. They shouldn't describe the manual. I mean, you don't want them to describe the manual. You want them to have the manual presented in a way that's logical and easily accessible. And it clearly refers only back to when agencies post publicly available versions. I mean, we're not talking about any paper versions.
Right. Yeah, my lean is also towards present. I do like the other changes that Kirti suggested, but I do like present over describe. But we should hear more comments on it. David, then back to Kirti.
Well, I agree with the point about preferring present, but the reason I raised my hand is I'd like to suggest that you clarified the part of the sentence that says they should post them, to say they should post the manuals. The them further on in the sentence.
Okay, yeah. So they should post the manuals, and got it.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah.
When we finish with this general subject, I want to go back to 6 and labeling this section. But that's
okay. We'll return to that shortly. Kirti, and then we'll go to Emily.
Yeah, so I'm not wedded to present or describe. I think my concern is that I did not understand what present was adding. So it needs to be on a website. I get that. It needs to be in a clear place on the website. That's what easily identifiable location means. Like, it needs to be easy to get to. And then I just don't quite know what present means, and I don't have any, dog in the fight about like what it should mean. I just, as a reader, it was not clear to me what you were asking the agencies to do. So if it's not naming the document or describing the document, it's something else, that's fine. But it should be clear.
That's a good point. So yeah, it's a question of what present is doing in addition, or is it redundant to posting them in an easily identifiable location? And if it's redundant, then does adding describe as a next sentence add some meaning that's helpful to this particular recommendation? Emily.
So I think describe introduces more. I think it makes the sentence less clear, but I hear Curdy's point, and now I'm wondering if that whole everything, including present and everything thereafter, is redundant.
So we could have post the manual in an easily identifiable location on their websites to ensure that potentially interested persons, including members of historically underserved communities, can easily find and use them. Would be sort of a modification that would
I have a
remove
different suggestion.
Okay, yes, Bill.
Let's take the post in an easily identifiable location and put that after. Present them in a clear and logical fashion and post them in an easily identifiable location.
Okay.
That makes it clear that there's these two separate ideas, that there's a place that's easily found and that what's presented is presented in this clear fashion.
Got it. Okay. So we go with they should present them in a clear and logical fashion and post or present the manual in a clear and logical fashion and post the manual or post it or them. So we take out they should post them, all that there. Yeah, I got it. Yeah, they should present. And we should still, in response to David's point, it should be present the manuals. Or manual and a clear and post the manual and post.
Just make up your mind whether you want to talk in the singular or plural.
Yeah, that's why. Yeah, I see you. I hear you. So when agencies post publicly available versions of I should put. I think we should go with the plural. Is my instinct. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at. I will kind of, I guess, continue to make the changes. Lon.
I don't understand why you need the first part under the dissemination paragraph. I mean, you're saying that the manuals should be clear and logical in their presentation. That's already in recommendation 3.
Recommendation 3.
Yeah. So the contents and manuals are presented in a clear, logical, comprehensive fashion. So that's how we already made that suggestion. This is about presentation, about posting and dissemination.
So let's go up to 3, Alexandra, if we can, just to kind of so everybody's on understands. So in a clear, logical, and comprehensive fashion. Yeah, that's does paragraph the sentence in paragraph 8 add anything to that, or is it redundant? It seems to me that it might be redundant. Jordan.
So when I think of this as something that's separate from just what's in paragraph 3, I think there are 2 ways that an agency can go when it posts its enforcement manual on the website. One is just you go to the page that says enforcement manual and you get a PDF of the manual. And I think the better practice that I've seen in my research is that when you go to the page on the agency website that says enforcement manual, you don't go straight to the manual. There's an intermediate step, and that's a separate page that says, this is the agency's enforcement manual. It's promulgated on such and such date. It is the product of the Division of Enforcement. It does not necessarily bind the agency or interested parties. There's sort of a presentation of what the manual is, what it's used for, that is helpful to sort of the outside party. So if the present has some kind of reference separate to, what's in paragraph 3, I think that would be what it would be referring to. So maybe that needs to be in the recommendation, maybe it doesn't. But as a matter of best practices, I think there are different ways you can present the manual on the website.
Okay.
Well, just to that point, then going back to the word describe is what you meant. You wanted a description of all that in a clear, logical fashion.
Jordan.
I don't really have a view on whether present or describe is a better term.
Okay.
Well, but if you're saying present, then you're presenting the manual. You're not presenting a description of the manual, which is, I think, what you were talking about. Seems to me you're either going to describe the manual, which is that interim step, or you're just going to present the manual. If you can
Should
just
we-
present the manual, we've already addressed it in 3. If you're going to describe it, we need to go back to where we were originally.
Is describe better than present a description? Does present a description describe capture present a description? Do you think, Lon?
Say that again.
So we could go back to describe, or we could go with what you just said, present a description. Is that just extra words that are unnecessary? Should we stick with describe?
I mean, I'm indifferent. It's just that I think it looks to me what we have there now is all we're doing, talking about is disseminating, okay? We're just posting a clear and logical version. If we want to say that there's 2 things, you're going to post the version, but you're also going to post a description, that's the interim step, then it has to go back to post a description or describe, or you have to explain that there's an interim step here. And I don't think either of the versions that we have are doing that.
Okay. Bill,
So you might say, in addition to, you should describe, okay?
in addition, okay.
I agree that Jordan's explanation for this makes the present sound a little strange. Although I didn't think that this was just redundant of 3, because 3 is what is the manual that the agency uses internally. And what we're talking about here is whatever is publicly released, which might be substantially different actually from what the agency itself has, depending upon what they include in and what they include out. I mean, in terms of to capture Jordan's point of some sort of introduction to the manual, I'd use, rather than present or describe, but maybe an introduction to the manual would be some sort of language I'd use. But I sort of take the point that neither present or describe captures Jordan's point.
Yeah. And so do you think that introduce does more to capture the point than present or describe, Bill?
I'm not wedded to the word introduce necessarily, but I prefer it to describe or present.
Okay. Michael and Emily.
So I had thought this paragraph was not so much about the content of the manual as the format. And I thought fashion was really just a word for format. And so understood, it's not really duplicative with 3, because 3 is about kind of the content and the structure and the presentation of the underlying manual. And I thought this was about ensuring that if we're putting something up on the web, it'd be user-friendly, members of the public be able to find it, that when they find it, they not be buried in text, that it be full text searchable, that there may indeed be some explanatory material that situates it for, non-expert users and so on. And so very focused not on like what's an enforcement manual, but how are we presenting it to the public when we choose to do so? And so I kind of thought neither present or describe is necessarily right, but what we wanted to say was something about, that they should post the manual in a clear, accessible, and user-friendly format, something like that.
Okay.
Which sort of steers us away from half the conversation we've been having. And I do sort of agree with Lon that in terms of like, what are the contents of the manual, and is the manual itself clear and logical? Yeah, that was covered back in 3. And we avoid the duplication by focusing in this paragraph about how the public-facing version is presented to the public and made accessible to the public.
Okay. So we could have, I don't know what the verb is, but we have whatever that verb is, introduce, we'll stick with right now, introduce the manuals in a user-friendly and accessible fashion or way, as a way to.
And I would put in easily searched or searchable, something like that. That's a critical piece of all of this.
User-friendly, easily searchable or searchable and accessible fashion. Okay, so that's one idea.
And I like format better than fashion. Fashion's an odd word here.
Yeah, okay, agreed. So format, okay. Emily.
So I think we're headed in the right direction, and I think we're right to junk both present and describe. I mean, I think we should figure out how to explain what we're getting at by maybe revisiting the reason that's provided at the end of the sentence, just to ensure potentially interested persons, including members of historically underserved communities, can easily find and use it. And it's about, you need more than just a description of what the document is. You need to be able to find it. It needs to be a document that's in a usable format, and you need to have sufficient context provided so that you know what it is and how and how to use it. And I think it's that contextualization that maybe we were trying to get at with the word present, and doesn't quite get it, and present isn't clear. Introduced, I think, is closer, but I think it's maybe still doesn't fully explain what we're trying to get the agency to do, which is just to provide this in a way that people understand, like, what its importance is and how they would use it, especially for those who don't have counsel who know what an enforcement manual is. I also would suggest that we kind of try to vomit out all the things that should be included, and then maybe have the committee on style figure out a way to say it more concisely, because this thing keeps getting longer in a way that I think is probably making it less clear. And I suspect that once we figure out exactly the concepts that we want to include, we can probably find, with a bit of wordsmithing that's difficult to do in this context, a more straightforward and concise way to communicate it.
So is there anything, Emily, that you would add in terms of the things we want to get at other than user-friendly, searchable, accessible? Are there other sort of features?
Yeah,
of it?
so all of those kind of speak to me about the document. I mean, I think it should be, readily findable in an accessible, in a usable format. And, this is where I struggle, is, adequately, introduced in a way that provides adequate contextualization. But that's a terrible phrasing. Don't use that.
Right.
And I think when we find the right word, then the meaning of it will be illuminated by the language at the end that explains the purpose of these requirements.
Okay. Thanks, Emily. Lon.
I think I'm getting confused here a little bit. I understand Emily's comments, Bill's comments, Michael's comments. Are we looking, when I look at 3, I think it's saying to the agency that your manual ought to be clear to your employees. It ought to be, I suppose, searchable, whatever, but it ought to be usable by your employees. I thought in this section, we're simply saying, take that usable manual and here's how you should present it to the public. I think I'm hearing that, well, whatever you're doing with your employees, it ought to be usable to the public. And maybe it needs to be a separate document. So I'm wondering, are we talking about 2 different documents, the one that the agency uses, and now we're gonna present or disseminate something different from that explains what the agency is using? Or are we simply saying, look, it ought to be usable, searchable by their employees, and you ought to disseminate that to the public with that same usable, searchable document? So I can't tell whether they have one, we're trying to get the idea of one usable, searchable document or 2 documents here, and I'm not sure where we're heading.
So as I understood Jordan's comment earlier, there was some intermediary document that was acting as sort of an introduction to the manual that perhaps is different than what, I mean, I guess the agency would also have it, but something that would be important to present to the public.
And is that what we're talking about here? That 6 says present the manual, and the rest of it is saying, by the way, you ought to put this other document out there too. Is that what we're talking about? That's a question. I'm not trying to argue a point.
Sure. Yeah. I won't put words in Jordan's mouth, but I'll let Jordan speak for himself.
So I think my point was not that we're talking about a completely separate document, but I was still talking about the way the manual is presented on the website to outside entities. So I think it was Emily who brought up the idea that you may have counsel who are representing entities before the agency who have no idea what an enforcement manual is. They're sort of general counsel, and they don't know, is this the document that I need in order to look up, what discovery privileges the agency respects, or is there something else? Is there another guidance document? So I'm not, to the extent I'm talking about sort of a separate page of the website, it's just the overall presentation of how is the enforcement manual presented so that it's useful to sort of non-experts or to people who are outside the agency who need it. I think that addresses the point.
Okay. So with that background, Emily, is that a lingering hand? Or
Yeah, no, I completely agree with what Jordan just said. And I mean, I think it's a matter of perspective. There should be one document. But that, the purpose and use of that document will be perfectly obvious to people in the agency and people who are sort of experts who work with the agency. But to someone who's just seeing this random document, like, sure, they can find it, but like, if it's not obvious what it is or why they would use it or why they would care, then what's perfectly transparent from an internal perspective is mysterious from an external perspective. So I think it's just a matter of, you put it on a website in a place where you can find it, but it's basically like a launch page that explains what it is and why you care. And I mean, I think we're talking like less than a paragraph of information probably, but just like, here's what this is, here's why it matters. And then the document itself is, in a format that actually makes it accessible.
So that would suggest a change to this recommendation, because it wouldn't just be introduce the manuals or provide the manuals in a clear, user-friendly, searchable, accessible format. It would be also to, I don't know, introduce them. I'm still struggling with it. Bill.
Yeah, I have actual language.
Okay,
right?
thanks. That's
Ready?
great. Yep.
Okay, and it's when agencies post publicly available versions of enforcement manuals, they should post them in an easily identified location on their websites and in an accessible format to ensure that potentially interested persons, including members of historically underserved communities, can easily find and use them. Post them in an easily identified location on their websites and in an accessible format.
And then that rest the part to ensure, yes.
Yeah, just an accessible format to ensure.
To ensure,
Just
keep
go
it
back.
to ensure, yeah.
Not so that out, but just to ensure. We
Make this
didn't
more readable,
cross-
I'm going to switch the view to simple markup for just a moment so you all can see it.
Okay, that'd be great.
Public, they should post easily identifiable location websites and an accessible format. And then take out.
And then take out everything after format.
Yeah, and take out and provide manuals and user-friendly, searchable.
Yeah,
It just should say
right.
to ensure, right?
Right,
An accessible
right.
format to ensure, yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's a proposal. What are thoughts that others might have? Michael.
So I think that this is okay. It's a little more bare bones, but it's okay. It totally loses Emily's point about, and Jordan's point about, that we're talking about two things here. One is the format of the document itself, and the other is this contextual, what Emily called contextualization. And so assuming people are on board with that being a distinct but also important aspect of this, we can keep everything Bill just suggested, but add a sentence. So when agencies post publicly available versions of enforcement manuals, they should provide an accompanying explanation of the nature and scope of the document, something like that, committee on style, period. The posted manual and then what Bill just gave us, right?
Okay.
The manual itself should be in an easily identified location, et cetera.
Okay, so we have kind of three parts here that I read into it. So we have location, easily identifiable, format, accessible, and then the contextualization, which is accompanying description, explanation. or whatever the committee on style decides is the best language to put in there. And so that's an attempt to capture all three. Yes, David.
I'd like to suggest as an alternative, going back one step and replacing where it says on the third line, the current third line of this, in an accessible format. Would it meet the need to say in a user-friendly format?
Mm-hmm.
So that gets the sense of serving the public's need.
Okay.
And while I'm speaking, let me renew my prior suggestion. Oh, well, now, depending on what you do, I still don't like the phrase, they should post them, they should.
Right.
You got all this extra language.
So we could have, they
post
should,
them.
right. So we could have in a user-friendly format instead of accessible. So we could have, they should provide an accompanying explanation and post the manuals in an easily identified location on their website and in a user-friendly format to ensure that potentially interested persons. Emily has some suggested language in the comments. Can't get to the comments because my cursor is not working. Sorry, got like cursor problems.
I suggest a comma after format.
Right. Okay, and with an intro. Okay.
I like Emily's version.
Okay, so we have an alternative version that's posted on in the comments. So it would say when agencies, and so it would start with they should post them, and with the introduction sufficient to ensure that potentially interested persons, right? And Emily, so do you have objections to user-friendly versus accessible?
No.
Okay, so going with David's, we could add user-friendly instead of accessible, unless someone objects. So they should post them in an easily identified location on the website in a user-friendly format and with an introduction sufficient to ensure that potentially interested persons, including members of historically underserved communities, can easily find and use them. I'm gonna let you guys sit with that for a little bit, see where we are.
Can we again fix they should post them?
They should post the manuals, yes. So they should post the manuals. Thank you. We keep re-adding that in there. We'll get it out at some point. Very pesky. I mean, who says a group of 20 people can't wordsmith? All right. Good times, everyone. All right. So if there are no objections to that change, we will incorporate that in. I think it does capture the three things we're trying to get at with that: format, location, and contextualization. Okay. And thanks, Alexandra, for working through that process with us. All right, so let's move on to recommendation number 9. Yes, Michael.
So this makes lots of sense. I sort of have a couple minor suggestions, which actually mainly began with Bernie Bell when we were talking about this. One is, notice of availability in the Federal Register, right? Agencies are always concerned about the costs, and this is not a sort of setting where it's obvious. We don't need some permanent citation or anything. So I don't know if we want to mention it, but if we want to mention it, I think I'd put it last rather than first. I would add as a fourth possibility, placing a notice on the agency's, on the homepage of the agency's website.
Okay.
And I would change or to and/or, because these are not mutually exclusive. An agency might well do all of them.
All right. So issuing a press release, making announcement of system and or right.
Yeah, so and or publishing a notice.
And or publishing, right. Okay. Any thoughts or comments on those proposed changes?
Is there anything in this anywhere that says when the agency changes the internal enforcement manual, it should make corresponding changes to the publicly available one?
Yeah, I believe there is, because earlier where we talk about posting it, there's a thing about the importance of keeping it up to date. In
Right.
seven.
Okay.
You only put it up if you have adequate resources to ensure that it's up to date.
Yeah, got
So
it.
it's sort of built in there.
Right. All right, sticking with number 9 for just a moment to see if anybody has thoughts, comments, feedback on the changes or just the overall recommendation. All right, so let's move forward to recommendation number 10.
Before you do that.
Oh yeah, go back to, yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you, David. Go back to the description of.
I've lost track of all the numbers, but
right.
What is number 6 is the only thing here that pertains to internal use. All the rest of it is public use. So my suggestion is to move 6 up to the previous section, which is about managing enforcement manuals, and to rename this section to have it clear this is about public availability.
Okay. And so you would rename the section.
Well, I'm not a bug on parallel naming. All the rest of these are gerund type words.
Right.
But, I would say public availability of enforcement manuals.
Okay. So you go public availability, not disclosing, or?
Well, some people are more of a bug than I on parallelism.
So there's option we could do. We would not be parallel with the section.
Well, you could say disseminating enforcement manuals to the public, kind of wordy.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Any objections to the change? Okay. So then let's go back down to number 10 then. Yes, Bill.
Well, this one ought to go back in the previous one on managing enforcement manuals, because this is not about disclosing to the public.
This one's on number 10, you're saying? This is the soliciting input on enforcement manual section now?
Right, from personnel. So that should go back to managing.
Got it. I guess I'll talk to ACA staff in terms of the thoughts with respect to why 10 was placed here, or whether it should be placed, whether you agree it should be placed in the managing section.
It could probably go either way. We only put it here because we had a section on disseminating and a section on soliciting input. But if we're going to make it one section on internal management and one section on making it publicly available, I think what Bill suggests is fine.
Okay.
And if we did that, then we just strike the title soliciting input and we'd leave 11 as part of the public.
Right, exactly. Okay. Okay, so
No, yeah.
okay. So accounting for that move, are there any other suggestions with respect to the content of 7 or objections to the move of 7 of what's current? The news version, new 7, I guess. Okay, and so if you could scroll back down, Alexandra, and we'll come to the last recommendation, which is now, or still, I guess now number 11, or still number 11. All right. So any other thoughts on the recommendations before we move on to the preamble? Any other recommendations that we've already covered that you may have thoughts on now? Okay, so why don't we move up to the preamble then? And we'll take this paragraph by paragraph, starting with the
Would you
first.
like to take a break for 10 minutes or 5 minutes?
Oh yeah, we can take a break. We can do that. Sorry. I don't mean to be such a hard driver. Why don't we take a break and come back? How is 5 or 10 preferable? Do people need 10?
I can deal with 5.
Okay, let's come back and 1:55 then, or 55. So we'll have Alexandra put the document back up, and we'll start where we left off with the first paragraph, for which there haven't been any changes made, but just wanted to work through it again to see if there are any comments or thoughts now on the second meeting. Yes, Bill.
I have a problem with the second and third sentences in the paragraph. It says statutes, agency rules, whether adopted after notice and comment or otherwise, and agency policies govern the exercise of agency's enforcement authority and direct the activities of enforcement personnel. And this idea that non-legislative rules govern the agency's authority, all right? It doesn't govern the agency's authority. And then the next sentence says, these laws and policies might explain. Well, the laws don't explain the relevant statutes. I mean, it just, there's sort of 3 steps here, all right? Where the first, we have statutes and agency legislative rules that provide the law that says what agencies have the authority to do and must do. And then we have agency policy guidance documents that then explain and interpret relevant statutes and rules, establish standards, priorities, procedures, assume complaints, et cetera, et cetera. So I would like to be able to say that the second sentence should say, statutes and agency rules adopted after notice and comment govern the exercise of agency's enforcement authority and direct the activities of enforcement personnel.
So that would be just, so that'd be removing agency policies then from that sentence.
Well, it would be adding and after statutes. It would say statutes and agency rules, and delete parenthesis whether, and delete or otherwise parenthesis, and then and agency policies.
Got it.
And then the next sentence would say agencies apostrophe policies, instead of these laws, say agencies policies explain, strike might, for example.
Okay. Got it. Yeah, that seems much clearer. Okay. I guess I'll start with see if there are any sort of feedback or objections. Do you have any objections to this change in language, Jordan?
I don't. I think the initial formulation it seems to cover policy statements and interpretive rules as opposed to merely sort of externally binding administrative law. But whether that's a detriment or a benefit is up to the committee.
Okay. Other thoughts? Okay, if there are no objections, then we'll incorporate that language into paragraph 1 of the preamble. Any other thoughts on paragraph 1 of the preamble? Okay. So we'll move to paragraph 2 of the preamble, and we do have a suggested change to paragraph 2 that is based on comments that are provided by Matt Weiner. If Matt is still here, I'm hoping he could provide any sort of further explanation beyond the comments that he shared with us with respect to the proposed change and whether the language reflects his thoughts accurately.
This is Matt here. I don't have anything to add to it. It was just some suggestion for the committee's consideration. The only thing I guess I might add is that this understanding of enforcement manuals constraining or circumscribing the discretion of lower agency officials is to some extent born out of my own experiences dealing with agencies as a lawyer. On any number of occasions and in any number of situations had occasion to say to sort of a higher up in an agency, look, your first level enforcement folks are not complying with the rules set up forth in your manual. No, they're not. It's not a legislative rule. I understand that, but I think they do provide. I think they can provide an important rule of law function. So beyond that, I don't really have anything to add unless there are any questions.
Are there any questions for Matt? We'll go with David, who has hand up that will be related, I assume.
After the changes that we made ad nauseum on what I think is 2C, which, among other things, has a modifier that says, including a disclaimer if applicable. The sentence that begins, although enforcement manuals should not, is going farther than what it says in 2C. So I would suggest to make it consistent with 2C, change that should not to either may not or do not necessarily. But the easy way is may not.
Okay. Okay, gotcha. The binding agency is all right. Okay.
It already says should not necessarily bind agencies. You already have necessarily in there.
Where?
Right after
On line 18. Should not necessarily bind agencies.
Oh, I didn't realize you had incorporated what I said before. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I didn't see that you did that.
Okay.
Put should back in, right?
Okay, so should not necessarily bind agencies as a whole. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. That was my original suggestion before we got into the whole to do about 2C.
Right, we went back and forth between the preamble and 2C. So,
okay, my whole point now is to make them consistent.
Got it. Okay.
Thank you.
So captured that. Any other thoughts on? Yes, Bill.
In order also to be consistent with what we added in the recommendation, perhaps a sentence here saying, and something about the public shouldn't necessarily rely on the enforcement manual. Although enforcement should not bind it, and I mean a sentence right following what we just said, because that's where it is in the recommendation.
Right. So Forget the
And I don't want to wordsmith it, but we just ought to have something about
Okay,
public, not rely on it.
right. So we could sort of add language parallel to what we say in 2C. With respect to reliance, okay. We will do that. Any other thoughts on paragraph 2 and the proposed changes that are made based on the comments from Matt? So then let's move to paragraph 3, and this is based on comments from Bernie Bell and Michael Hertz. I don't think Bernie is here. So I think if Michael is still here, whether he would like to offer any additional comments beyond what was already stated in his email comments to the committee.
Yeah, not really. I mean, there's no point in going through every word of this. The impulse here was, and this is what we discussed at the last meeting, to have a slight kind of nudge towards FOIA's presumption of openness and the importance of disclosure. And so the additions are to begin, with the proposition that under FOIA in general, staff manuals have to be made public, right? And we're concerned about secret law and so on. Now, enforcement manuals are a somewhat different creature, and there are powerful countervailing arguments against disclosure that apply just to enforcement manuals and not other kinds of staff manuals, and that's reflected in the case law and acknowledged here. But it seemed important to sort of at the outset, understand that enforcement manuals are kind of an outlier with regard to agency materials and manual generally, and manuals in particular. So that was the first goal. The second was to just sort of make clear this idea that, to the extent you're in facilitating and enhancing compliance, disclosure is a good idea. And to the extent you're facilitating, enhancing circumvention and law breaking, disclosure is a bad idea. And that's sort of the basic trade-off here. And then third, again, to make clear the possibility of redaction. And fourth, it closes with this statutory presumption of openness, that even when something is not required to be disclosed under the statute, it has to be, unless the agency can really articulate a foreseeable harm from disclosure, which it will often be able to do with enforcement manuals. Mm-hmm. But so it's the kind of overall FOIA contextualization that we were, I think, aiming for here. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's a significant substantive change to what was there already. It's a little more kind of flavor than substance.
Right. So Jordan, you had an extensive FOIA analysis in your report, and I wanted to get your thoughts in terms of whether the additional language that is more explicit about FOIA and sort of encourages and shifts the orientation towards openness comports with your findings and your thoughts in your report.
So I think what Michael says makes sense. My initial report, and I think the recommendation based on it, were initially drafted very cautiously in terms of advising agencies on what their obligations and policy should be regarding FOIA. But I have no problem with this, especially if it better harmonizes it with other recommendations that ACUS is currently working on.
Okay. So I'll give folks a chance to kind of read through it before making comments. We got thumbs up from Bill. That's good. And how much is below this page, Alexandra? Just a couple sentences. Okay. Okay, got it. I think that's pretty easy. Okay, so are any other comments on these changes? Definitely accord with Michael's suggestion. I appreciate you adding this language and to the report or to the recommendations. Are there any thoughts or objections to these changes, to these revisions? All right, we'll consider them to be accepted.
Great, thanks.
Great, thank you, Mike.
Can I just ask, sorry, as you may have noticed, I was distracted. I had also submitted a comment on earlier, a couple lines earlier.
Oh, you did? Oh, sorry, I missed
And I
it.
don't know if that was there at lines 15 to 16. Did everyone just approve that while I was not paying attention, or is that?
Yeah, I think we have approval of the second paragraph, other than adding language to parallel to 2C regarding public reliance.
Right, okay, but the.
Right. Oh, yeah, I remember that.
The wording change at the footnote there was adopted.
Right.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks.
Yes. That's right. Okay. All right, so the next paragraph, which I think is the last paragraph of the preamble. Any suggested changes or any comments or thoughts on paragraph 4 of the preamble? Okay, and any other overarching thoughts about the preamble as a whole? Okay, guess that's where we are. So, I mean, one question that arises is whether committee members think that there's a need for a third meeting on the enforcement manuals. We have one set of changes that aren't sort of embedded in the document yet with respect to adding language with respect to public reliance on in the preamble. But other than that, I think we've incorporated all the suggested changes in the wording of the document. We could, if we do want to have a third meeting, it would be scheduled in 2 weeks. If people think that's necessary, but I want to get a sense of the committee whether a third meeting is thought to be necessary to finalize, I guess, this report. Does anyone object to not having a third meeting? I guess I'll start from that. So whatever finalization of the report will be shared, of course, with the committee. Comments will be welcome. And if it later comes to being that there is a need for a third meeting, we could always add it back to the schedule. But right now we will go forward with the assumption that we will not have a third meeting on this, and we'll leave it to the committee, to the staff, ACA staff, to make the revisions or incorporate the revisions and to share the recommendations and the preamble with the rest of us when those revisions are complete. Okay. So I will now turn it over to Chairman Foyce for the final comments and steps forward for us.
Don't you need a vote?
Oh, do we? Okay, this is my first time. So we need to vote to approve of the report. Is that the vote? Okay, so sorry, Chairman.
We're voting to approve the recommendation.
Recommendations, right?
Proposed recommendation.
Got it. Thank you. So all in favor of the proposed recommendation, you use that hand. All committee members who are eligible to vote, if you could use that raise hand function to vote in favor of the recommendations. And is Jeremy or Alexandra capturing all those hands, I hope, or counting? And assuming that they're all counted, give you a chance to lower your hands now. And all those opposed to adopting the recommendations of the report, please raise your hands. Okay. And so we will conclude the voting. Alexandra, do you have the count for that? Or I don't know if we announce it.
The ayes have it.
The ayes have it. Okay, well, good. That's good. All right. So I think that will conclude my official duties in a stumbling way, but we got there. And now I will turn it over to Andy for final comments. And
thank you, Bertrand, and thank you to everyone for donating your time and expertise to this important ACUS project. As Bertrand suggested, we'll be implementing your decisions on the final draft and making some committee on style minor edits, getting it back to you and getting it ready for transmission to the ACUS Council for hopefully after their edits, for their approval to send it on to the Assembly, which is December 15th. As to the council, we're trying to schedule it for the week of the 14th because Thanksgiving week being unavailable kind of pushes us a week earlier than perhaps standard. So hopefully we won't need a third meeting because the third meeting is tentatively scheduled for the 15th. So let's try to avoid that, and hopefully the council, 6 of whom are new, you may know. So like our chairman, they will be doing this for the first time, and hopefully won't make many changes. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day. Oh, a special thank you. I neglected a special thank you for Bertrand for his steady leadership.
Thank you so much, Andy. I appreciate that. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Jeremy, for guiding me through the chairing of this meeting. And thanks to all of you for your contributions and for being patient with with me and my mistakes. I look forward to seeing you all again soon at our next meeting on whatever matter is presented to us. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Bertrand. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.